Having grown up in Eastern Europe, I have more than a few stories I could share from my childhood. Perhaps the closest call happened when I was 6 or 7 years old. It may only be because of my father's wisdom that I'm able to tell this story today. I was in my room playing computer games when a van outside caught my attention. It was an old white thing that had been parked at the beginning of our street. I remember the guy's face that got out of it. He looked like any other normal guy you might pass in town. Just your average working man. From what I could tell, he was going from door to door, no doubt trying to sell something. Eventually, there's a knock on our door. My father goes to answer it. He opens the door, and the guy from the van is standing on our porch. From what I could overhear, the guy said that he was a home security salesman, and asked my dad if he'd be interested in having some cameras and alarms installed. My dad calmly and confidently told him that we already had a home security system, that it was set up all around the house, and that it was working perfectly. The salesman smiles, says no problem in a friendly tone, and moves along to the other houses down our street. 2 days pass, and I wake up on a Sunday morning to find our street filled with police cars. Like the salesman before, investigators are going door to door, asking people questions. Our turn comes around, and again, my dad answers the door. The officer standing on our front porch greets my father, and in a very matter-of-fact way, tells him that somebody had broken into one of our neighbors' homes and murdered the entire family inside. My dad talks with them for a while. I didn't know what about at the time. My mother sent me into another area of the house, not wanting me to hear about the details of the murder. As I would later find out, all 5 members of the household had been beaten to death with a hammer while they slept. Mother, father, and children. A whole family wiped out. Sometime later, we're watching the television. They start talking about the murder case on the news. Apparently, the killer had been arrested. A man's face flashes up on the screen. 3 guesses as to who it was. My child brain hadn't been able to put 2 and 2 together, but for the adults down our street, the answer must have been as clear as day. It was the salesman. As he went to each house in our street, he hadn't been trying to sell home security. He was scouting for vulnerable homes to target. Our house didn't have any kind of security whatsoever. No alarms, no cameras, no nothing. But my dad instinctively knew not to tell the guy that, and responded instantly. Had he paused for a moment, the salesman may have seen through his lie. Then he might have chosen to pay us a visit that night. The creepiest part to me is that the salesman didn't give off a creepy vibe. He appeared to be just a normal, regular guy. I learned a very valuable lesson that day. When someone comes to your door and tries to sell you home security, always tell them that you already have it, and that it's working perfectly.
It was spring in rural northeast Arkansas, and a family, we'll call them the Smiths, were going about their usual day-to-day lives when they began noticing some unusual activity on their property. Random items in and around their home were moved or missing altogether. Picture frames hung vacant on the wall where family photos had previously been displayed. Keys from their vehicles that were brought inside were found outside and inside them, and food seemed to vanish from their pantry overnight. While some instances could be chalked up to absent-mindedness, or possibly one of their 5 children as the culprit, Mrs. Smith grew increasingly suspicious after realizing kitchen knives had joined the list of elusive objects. Her suspicion began to curdle, churning over to dread, as the tally of the items began rapidly growing each day. Then some of Mrs. Smith's personal items began reappearing outside on the hood of her truck. Some mornings she would find the objects haphazardly thrown upon the hood. Other mornings deliberately arranged neatly around handwritten notes. I wish I knew the contents of those first disturbing notes, but whatever they contained was enough to cause the couple to thoroughly search their property, yielding no results. They were certain no one had driven up to their house. The distinguishable crunched gravel under wheels, nor tire marks in sand or soil had been present. They began locking their doors before retiring for the evening, which remained locked the following morning. The Smiths believed their late-night intruder would desist after witnessing their meticulous investigation. However, I would not be writing this if that were the case. Notes began appearing within their home, which according to my source outside the media, addressed the children by name and stated things the family had discussed during the previous evening's dinner. Honestly, I don't know how they didn't nope out of there right then, especially as things only continued to escalate. The tipping point came for the family of 7 when they discovered the latest note scrawled onto the wall inside their home. "I'm coming for you. All of you." They combed their property again, and again finding nothing. Mrs. Smith urged her husband to lock the deadbolts along with the handles that evening. He obliged as the deadbolts were fitted to a different key than the door handles. Upon waking, they found each of the deadbolts securely in place, but the door handles had all been unlocked. Fed up, Mrs. Smith and her eldest daughter went on their final patrol, this time armed with a .22 rifle. After hearing noises come from beneath their mobile home, the two pulled back the underpinning, a barrier that goes around the bottom of a manufactured home, revealing the root cause of the family's terror. Crouched under their home, amongst wrappers of missing food, family photos, random objects, lighters, knives, spare house keys, and car keys, and a makeshift bed, was a woman. She was older, her salt and pepper hair greasy and matted, her face and clothes covered in her own filth, dirt, and grime. She snarled, hissed, and growled like a rabid animal, glaring out to the two with beady, bloodshot eyes. The mother and daughter immediately recoiled and called the authorities. It took over 3 hours for police, fire, and EMT personnel to remove her. The family estimated she had been living under their home for, at absolute minimum, a week. She knew all the children's names, ages, grades, their favorite subjects in school, and other personal information about the family learned by eavesdropping from mere feet beneath them. Thankfully, this uninvited guest didn't cause any physical harm, though I'm sure the Smiths will carry some unseen emotional scars. And she was removed without any injury to responders or herself. No charges were filed on the woman, so law enforcement agencies are not required to release any of the intruder's information. Rumor has it that she was a little person, or incredibly short in stature, that escaped a mental facility a state or two over, stole a car, and drove it until it ran out of gas, then ended up walking to her final destination at the Smith's house. A crazy series of incredibly unlikely events leading to this family being traumatized. Once in custody, the woman was taken to a small local hospital where she escaped, only to be later found hiding amongst some bushes close by. As far as anyone knows, she's been returned or transferred to another mental health facility. I truly hope she received the help and supervision she required. The writer's thoughts. Why did they let things escalate so much before engaging their deadbolts? I guess since I was raised in the city, instead of in the middle of nowhere, locking doors is a habit. I personally would have been strapped with something stronger than a .22 while patrolling my property, but it's likely that's the firearm Mrs. Smith felt most comfortable and confident wielding due to its nearly non-existent recoil. And lastly, I commend her for not shooting the crazy person hiding under her floor that threatened her children and acted like a rabid animal upon being discovered.
So this story didn't happen to me, but I heard it many times when I was growing up. My grandparents owned 80 acres about 20 miles east of Snowflake, Arizona. They had moved to the land in the early 80s after my grandfather had retired from the mine. The land was pretty barren, and I really don't know why they chose to buy it. Red sandstone bluffs and dry washes cut across the landscape, dotted with juniper and cedar trees, and just pretty much red sand everywhere. I suppose at the time that the land was cheap. They didn't have close neighbours, though. The closest was about a mile away, which was my aunt and uncle. The next closest neighbour was a man named Stoddard. I never got his first name, just Stoddard. The story goes that one day after losing a calf, Stoddard stumbled upon a cave sealed by a giant slab of sandstone against one of the sides of the bluff. Curious about it, he used a backhoe to remove the boulder. After going inside, he discovers a burial cave, and I'm sure that he was delighted. He starts taking things from the burial cave and selling them. And well, from that moment on, he just had some really terrible luck. First, he lost about $500,000 in the stock market. Then his cattle all got diseased and died. He was pretty much in financial ruin, and he gets another blow. His wife gets diagnosed with an extremely rare disease and dies. Then Stoddard gets thrown from his horse and loses his ability to walk. This all happens within a couple of years, mind you. He tells everyone that he knows that he's cursed from the burial ground. They all laugh it off, but Stoddard puts all the artifacts back that he still has, and seals the cave back up with the boulder. And then he simply abandons all his belongings and just up and leaves one night. This is in the late 1980s, but fast forward a couple of years since Stoddard abandoned his ranch house. The land and the house are bought by a man from California. He puts the ranch house up for rent. My aunt is pregnant with her first son and decides to move up to Snowflake to be closer to her parents. Stoddard's house is actually fully furnished still, and so my aunt and her husband move in. He finds a job working nights at the local paper mill, and at first it seems like a nice little place. Creepy at night, admittedly, but not too bad. But then, weird stuff starts happening. For instance, my aunt starts hearing faint chanting and drums at night. She brushes it off. She had a hippie neighbour that lived about a mile away up on the bluff, so she figures that it must be one of them doing, well, hippie stuff. But she just can't help but feel like someone or something is always watching her all the time. She starts having terrible nightmares every night, but chalks it up to being alone and hormones and whatnot. She finally tells my grandpa about it, and he loans her his dog to keep her company at night. She drives the dog out there, but he just refuses to get out of the truck. The hair on his back is straight up, and he's growling now. She gets freaked out, but figures that maybe he saw a rabbit or something and hauls him into the house. The dog just stares at the door all night and growls. That night too, he growls and barks pretty much all night, all throughout the house. The drums and the chanting are louder this time. And the next morning, my aunt finds human bare footprints around the house. This goes on for about a week too, and the dog barks and growls at night, nightmares when she goes to sleep, footprints in the morning. The chanting and the drums keep getting louder, and finally, feeling like she's losing her mind, she asks my grandma to come over and stay the night with her. Grandma is more than happy to do this. After finishing her chores, she heads over, planning to make my aunt a nice meal. This is late in the afternoon. My aunt lays down for a nap, comfortable now that my grandma is there. My grandma decides to take a little walk at the base of the bluff. My grandma was actually a very religious person. She was very active in the church and devoted her life to Jesus. As she was out on her little walk, she likes to look for pottery shards or arrowheads and stuff like that. A little ways from the house, she gets a very unnerving feeling that something is watching her, though. She said that it made her skin crawl and she could sense something evil. So my grandma prays and walks back to the house pleading the blood of Christ. She decides not to say anything to my aunt, who is awake because she's already pretty frightened. But she tells my aunt that maybe it's a better idea to stay at Grandma's house tonight. My aunt eventually agrees. By the time my aunt gets her stuff together, though, the sun is about to go down behind the bluff. Grandma, aunt, and dog all load up in the pickup. Grandma turns the key and nothing. She tries again. Nothing. Not being very mechanically inclined, Grandma goes into the house to call Grandpa, but he doesn't answer. She remembers that he was going into town this afternoon, and dang. So they unload and go back into the house, waiting for Grandpa to get home. It's nighttime now, no moon, pitch dark. The dog begins its low growl again. The sounds of chanting and drums begin, faint at first but growing louder. My grandma begins to pray in between calling Grandpa. Remember too that this is a time way before cell phones. And all of a sudden they hear something howl outside. Not a coyote howl, but something more ominous and large. And something is moving just beyond the reach of the porch light. Both women are beyond terrified at this point. And finally, after turbo dialing Grandpa so many times, he answers. My grandma is absolutely frantic at this point and says, "Elvin, something is outside of the house. You need to get here now." For what seems like hours, though, they wait for Grandpa's truck to come over the hill. Finally, they see the headlights. But before Grandpa flies into the driveway, something runs across the road in front of him. His headlights illuminate an animal, something. Grandpa jumps out of the truck yelling for the women to get the hell in. He unloads a couple of shots in the general vicinity of this animal. They haul ass down the dirt road towards Grandma's house. And my aunt, against her better judgment, looks back and she says that she sees red eyes watching them. The next day, too, my grandpa and uncle head over to the house. Grandpa verified that all around the house there were bare footprints in the sand, along with some really large coyote tracks. Needless to say, my aunt and grandma never went back to that house. My aunt won't even talk about it, in fact. I made the mistake of staying up too late one night and listening to the adults talk. My aunt actually moved in with my grandparents, but my grandma swears, though, that she would from time to time see those red eyes at night, just stalking the edge of her property. As far as I know, other people have tried living in Stoddard's house, but leave within a month or two. That whole area just seems to be cursed or something. I've always hated going out there too, because it has just a sort of an oppressive evil feeling to it, even at my grandparents too. I have more stories about this place involving other family members, but that'll have to wait for another time, because this is all I can muster up for now. But after researching and talking to some of my Native American friends, I'm fairly certain that my family members had the misfortune of running into a skinwalker. According to the Native Americans in the area, they frequent burials and graveyards, allegedly, looting and desecrating the sites. They take pieces of the brains and the bodies and grind them into a corpse powder or something to use in their curses. They also are known to terrorize people away from areas like burials and ruins, which is apparently why they think that it's a skinwalker.